Every day, young people are asking, who am I? Where do I fit? What difference can I make?
These three questions of identity, belonging, and purpose drive all the rest.
As family members and leaders, we all want to be there for the young people we care about.
Teenagers need adults like you, family members, mentors, and faith leaders who are ready to listen.
Really listen, because teenagers have a lot of questions.
But the best conversations happen when we get to the question beneath the question. Those are the moments that change teenagers and us.
I'm Brad Griffin.
I'm Kara Powell.
We are researchers, pastors, and parents.
In this course, we'll share research-based insights, and we'll equip you with ideas and practical tools you can start using this week.
We want you to have these ideas handy and use them yourself so you can effectively walk with teenagers toward Jesus' best answers to their biggest questions.
Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Joyce Crew Dalrymple, and I'm excited to host this webinar for Seminary Now on what teens wish you knew, how to have conversations that matter, and to learn from my friends Kara Powell and Brad Griffin about this really important topic. I am a pastor, a women's ministry leader, and writer, but my most challenging and rewarding job is that I'm a mom to 3 kids, 2 teenagers, 16 and 13, and one who already acts like a teenager. So I am thrilled that Seminary Now decided to create a course that helps parents like me and the church interact with and understand the younger generations. And I can't think of two better people to lead us in that than Kara Powell and Brad Griffin. This webinar is a companion to their new Seminary Now course, which launched last week. The course is called Connecting with Teenagers, and you can find it at seminarynow.com. I've been a Seminary Now subscriber for many, many years, and am now an ambassador, which means I get to preview and tell you about their amazing array of courses. If you're not familiar with Seminary Now, it's one of today's leading digital hubs for providing streaming video courses on topics like the Bible, theology, leadership, ministry, and justice. There are over 90 courses in their library, and you can watch them anywhere, anytime. All right, so let me do some quick introductions before we get into our panel discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by my friends Kara Powell and Brad Griffin. Kara is the executive director of the Fuller Youth Institute, the founder of the 10 by 10 collaboration, and the chief of leadership formation at Fuller Theological Seminary. Named by Christianity Today as one of 50 women to watch, Kara speaks regularly at national parenting and leadership conferences and has written a number of books, including Sticky Faith, Everyday Ideas to Build Lasting Faith in Your Kids. She and her husband have 3 children, 2 young adults and 1 teenager. Brad Griffin is the Senior Director of Content and Research for the Fuller Youth Institute, where he develops research-based resources for youth ministry leaders and families. A speaker, writer, and volunteer pastor, Brad is the co-author of over 15 books. He and his wife live in Southern California and have 3 teenagers and young adult kids. Kara and Brad are the co-authors of 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager, which is the basis of their Seminary Now course. The course is co-sponsored by Fuller Youth Institute. Hi, Kara. Hi, Brad. Thank you for being with us.
Joyce, it's great to be with you and everyone gathered here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. Before we get started, I want to invite you, the participants, either now or at any time during the webinar, to post your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You can go ahead if you want and leave a comment to tell us where you're connecting from. All right, let's get started. To set the stage, Kara, what led you to research and write about teenagers? What drew you to this work, and why does it matter so much to you?
Yeah, thanks, Joyce, for asking that good question. Well, we at the Fuller Youth Institute, we're just super passionate about young people. We love young people, and we love the adults who influence young people. So our mission is to equip diverse leaders and parents so faithful young people can change our world. And about 20 years ago, we started seeing what happens to high school students when they leave youth group. A whole compilation of studies indicates that about half of youth group graduates from great families, great churches like those represented in this conversation, in this webinar, about half of those drift from God and the church. And we wanted to find out why that was and how we could build sticky faith. So that was our first initial foray into research. But the more that we studied young people over the last 2 decades, the more that we've seen that faith longevity is about so much more than youth group. It's about families and really the whole church, the adult community surrounding young people. And so we wanted to give caring adults, family members, congregants, aunts, uncles, neighbors, we wanted to give them the tools they needed to really listen to the young people right in front of us today. Because Joyce, I agree with you. My roles at Fuller are fairly complicated, but by far my most complicated role in my life is being a mom to our 24, 22, and 18-year-old kids who I love so much. And so we wanted to equip all of us as adults to have better conversations and connections with the young people we care about.
Awesome, thanks. And I know you identify in your research that the three biggest questions driving teenagers are identity, belonging, and purpose. Brad, can you unpack why these questions are so foundational and how they shape a teenager's life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we all know, I'm also a parent of teenagers and young adults. My kids are 22, 19, and 16. And, every teenager is a walking bundle of questions. If you've ever interacted with a teenager, I also work with teenagers at my church. And, they're just full of questions. And sometimes those questions come out. Sometimes they're bottled inside. We have to draw them out, or we're sort of wondering what they're thinking and feeling. But a lot of us adults who are in their lives, unfortunately, we shy away from some of their deepest questions about meaning, about faith. And sometimes we're pitching answers that are nowhere near their strike zone. One 15-year-old told a friend of ours, "I wish adults would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking." And that really, kind of hits home for us. I feel that as a leader. I feel that as a parent. I do it, even though I know better. But we believe that almost based on our research and others, that almost every question that teenagers are wrestling with, it ultimately comes down to one of these three. Who am I? Where do I fit? Where do I really belong? And what difference can I make? And these are not just teenager questions. Of course, they're human questions. We feel them as adults. They chase us throughout our lifetime. But the thing to keep in mind is that for adolescents in particular, these questions are front burner, rolling boil kinds of questions where, we may sort of let them go to the back burner or kind of be on simmer. For teenagers, they're right front and center all the time.
And I'm wondering just practically, if those are the things that they're really concerned about, but they're not like asking them explicitly.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'm asking them, how was your day? Just like your regular daily talk. And I can only get like one word answers. So I'm not getting much from them. What are some practical ways that we as parents can ask better questions to have those types of meaningful conversations?
Yeah, and Joyce, lest you be under any illusions, it's not like Brad and I say to our own kids, "Well, you're asking a question about belonging right now. Let's go deeper in that."
Right.
Let's unpack your belonging issues.
Let's unpack your belonging issues. Pull up a chair. This paradigm of identity, belonging, and purpose is just super helpful for us as adults to have in our own minds, because Joyce, like you, a lot of times I, as a parent, I'm trying to have a good conversation with my kids and I get mixed results. So welcome to the club. And, Brad and I, given our kids are roughly the same age, I can't even count, Brad, how many conversations you and I have had with other colleagues at the Fuller Youth Institute, debriefing our own conversations, like what could we have done better? So parenting is just a constant learning journey. And, having three kids, it's clear to me that some kids are more chatty than others. And it certainly depends on the mood that kids in. And that young people, they're really transitioning to getting so much of that sense of belonging from their peers. So you are not a bad parent if you're getting shrugs or one-word answers like, welcome to the club. Now, having said that, I think all of us, and I'm holding up the mirror to myself here, we can get better at asking better questions. and having questions that are actually generative and could lead to a better conversation. So based on the research we've done with Amazing Families nationwide, we actually have some really specific recommendations on phrases that are helpful. So folks might want to jot some of these down. In general, it's better to have open-ended questions and conversation prompts. So a phrase that I use quite a bit is, I'm curious. I'm curious. In fact, I used this with our 24-year-old son 2 days ago. This past weekend, we had a 60th birthday party for my husband, which was super fun. He knew the party was happening, but there were a lot of surprises connected with it. And it was such an amazing time to just celebrate the community that God's blessed us with. And so 24 hours after the party, I'm taking my 24-year-old to the airport who had flown down for the party. And I just thought, you know what, I want to see, what sparked in Nathan by being at this party. And so I started my conversation with, I'm curious. And I said to Nathan, you know what, I'm curious, Bud, that's my nickname for him. I'm curious, Bud, like, how did being at the party and seeing these people who celebrated your dad, how did that make you think about who you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I knew he couldn't fathom like as old as my husband and I are, but with this shorter window, like, how does that help you think about who you want to be? And he was open to having the conversation. So we spent about 10 minutes talking about that just 2 days ago. And that phrase, I'm curious, is such a winner. It's game changing. So use that with your young people. Tell me more. That's such a great phrase too. When your young person says something and maybe you're not even sure how to follow up, say, tell me more about that. One family that we interviewed, like, they loved that phrasing so much, they made it a poster and put it in their living room because they wanted their teenage and young adult kids and their friends to know, hey, this is a place where you can tell me more. Also, I can imagine that is a third helpful phrase. Gosh, I can imagine that maybe you're wondering, or I can imagine that's really hard for you. I can imagine that if I were you, I'd be thinking this. And that's another way to empathetically have a better conversation. And then I'll tell you, an image that has helped me so much as a parent comes from agriculture. And I am no farmer, and I don't know much about agriculture, but the metaphor is picking fruit off a tree. And if fruit is ripe, then when you pick it, it just comes off the tree naturally. And, when you're picking fruit, you don't want to like wrestle with the branch and force it off. And so even, Nathan 2 nights ago, debriefing my husband's party on the way to the airport, like I asked that I'm curious question, and that was my gentle tug, a gentle tug in the conversation. And if he wasn't open, then I wasn't going to force it. Let me just say the relationship is worth so much more than trying to force that fruit to happen. And this particular instance, he was open. So I would say, as you're having that conversation with a young person, give a gentle tug, ask an open question. And if they want to go further, then great, but you don't need to force it. There'll be other windows where you can try again.
I love that. I love that analogy so much. And so much of it depends on their mood in the moment, reading, how talkative they are at that particular moment. And sometimes I'm curious, like with their behavior.
Nice job, Joyce, using I'm curious, by the way. Way to go. Way to put into practice.
You saw that.
Nice.
But when they are, talking about something just about life, whatever, their friends, how can we get to a deeper point? Like, it's just kind of surface conversation. How can we tell that they're really asking a question beneath the question? And it might point to something along the lines of like identity or belonging or purpose. And they really do want to talk. How do we get them to that place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, sometimes it's, it's when we run into things that actually maybe rub us a little bit wrong. And so, okay, this may or may not be a familiar scenario. You pick up your 15-year-old from Thursday night soccer practice. she slumps in the passenger seat, she snaps at you, or bursts into tears. This may or may not have happened to me in the past. And as a parent, you're kind of annoyed. You might even be angry. You've like you've put in some work here. You're doing her a favor. You didn't do anything wrong. But what you don't see in that moment is, that kid was just out there giving her all for 2 hours on literal playing field where she might be working out, who am I really? Am I an athlete? What kind of an athlete am I in? Like, how does this, and working out belonging? Do I fit here? Do they like me? What does the coach think of me? And purpose, what part is this going to have in my life? And how am I thinking about this the next few years? And, that's a lot of work to do on top of the work of practice, which has a whole other layer of things. And so, of course that kid's going to get in the car exhausted or exhilarated. I mean, like there's a wide range there. And may or may not want to talk to you about it, but she's been holding it together, and now she's in a safe place where she can just shut down or be grumpy. And, lucky you can take it. You can handle it because you're a safe space. We're big fans here of psychologist Lisa D'Amour, and one of her catchphrases, she says, "School gets the best of them, we get the rest of them." And I think that's so true. We can sub in sports or, drama or whatever activity in there. But when they're out in these spaces and they're having to perform and they're having to work through the questions in real time and kind of work out how they're going to, engage. And then when they're with us, if we're the parents or the caregivers, kind of let down or they shut down. And the more we understand that, what I have found in particular is it can help me empathize more. It can help me think, okay, this may not even be about me at all. This may not be about anything that I've actually done or said. I don't need to turn this into some sort of big blow up if it's really, could actually be about one or more of those big questions. And it can just like take the edge off a little bit, and I think sometimes too, we can gently, invite some better conversation about it. Quite honestly, sometimes that conversation might need to be 2 hours later or the next day. The other thing here is timing. I mean, to kind of piggyback too on what Kara was sharing, man, timing is everything with teenagers. And honestly, sometimes their timing doesn't fit very conveniently with our best timing. I go to bed earlier than I used to, and teenagers, they get chattier later at night. And so sometimes we have to sort of figure out, how and when to make some sacrifices. I've talked to so many parents who've said, just about the time I'm ready to clock out, they're ready to check in. And they get chatty, and they're willing to sort of, process a little bit. So that can be tricky for us.
Right. And we just have to be available when they're available. I had a friend who said that it's sort of like having outlets. And if all of your outlets there's like a plug in because you're really busy, there's when they're ready to plug in and you have no available outlet, then, there's no conversation. So having enough margin and being available when they're available. So that's a really, I'm glad you brought that up, Brad. This is kind of switching the conversation a little bit over to faith. And I think a lot of our parents are looking at this generation and wondering, how is their faith growing? What is God doing in their spiritual journey? We may have peeks and glimpses of it here and there, but they're often they're really busy with sports. They're connected online. When are they? I don't know. When do we get to see what God is doing in their lives? So wondering how you see God at work in this generation of teenagers.
Yeah. In all sorts of ways, actually. And so, Brad and I and the Full Youth Institute team, we're certainly very aware of what a tough season this is for this generation, mental health challenges at an all-time high. So much stress related to technology, uncertainty about the future, etc. And yet, here's what's interesting. This generation, in fact, Pew just came out with some data a few weeks ago. This generation of young people, they are especially spiritual. They are very open to spirituality. Now, note, I didn't say they're open to organized religion, and we'll get there in just a sec. But, I think this generation, they understand the bad news of the brokenness of our world. They've experienced that palpably. And that makes the good news that Jesus offers all the more appealing. And this generation thinks really highly of Jesus, which is great news for us. In some recent Barna research that looked at 25,000 teenagers globally, they thought very highly of Jesus. They were very positive about Jesus. It's the church that they tend to be a little bit more negative to. But God is working in some powerful ways. College campuses in particular are seeing that these days. Of course, many of us are probably familiar with the Asbury Renewal, Revival, Awakening, Outpouring a few years ago. But other college campuses are seeing that too. InterVarsity, I'm on the board of InterVarsity, and they're reporting their highest year-over-year growth since 1980. One of my favorite stories from InterVarsity is a staff member who showed up for the first weekly large group meeting this fall, and she thought she was in the wrong room because there were 120 college students in the room. And last year, when the group ended, there had been 20 college students, and it had grown that much. So there's something about this generation that is really open to, what Brad and I would say are Jesus's best answers to these identity, belonging, and purpose questions. And so when adults, I'll quote Young Life here, when adults earn the right to be heard, then there are lots of open doors with young people. And, as Brad was talking about that soccer scenario with with a 15-year-old.
Theoretically,
hypothetical. I was also hypothetically thinking about some parenting moments that I've heard about. And I'll quote Lisa D'Amour again, because for me, one of the most helpful phrases she's offered me as a parent is when your kids push against you, and it's inevitable that they will. They're holding so much, they're developmentally experiencing so much, they're struggling, etc. When they push against you, Lisa D'Amour says that we as adults, we need to be a wall for them. We need to be a wall for them. And I grew up swimming, so I think about swimmers who kick off a swimming pool wall. And young people do that against us as parents, caregivers, caring adults in developmentally appropriate ways as they're trying to figure out identity, belonging, and purpose. And when they kick against us, when they spend less time with us, when they seem to withdraw from us, it's easy for me to take that personally, to have my feelings be hurt, to even be frustrated about it. And I have reminded myself in those parenting moments so many times, Kara, be a wall. Kara, be a wall. Because eventually that kid's gonna want to come back. And if I haven't moved, if I haven't withdrawn, if I haven't backed away in self-protection, then it's so much easier for that young person to reach out. So I would just say this generation, they're open to Jesus and looking for adults who will be that unconditional loving wall for them.
Mm-hmm. And they'll swim back to that wall when they get tired of out there in the world and they need some safety and they need a refuge.
Yeah.
So if you're present, they will come back to you, and then they might push you away again.
Totally. Yeah, this is not a one and done process. Yeah. Like this is an iterative process. I mean, we had some colleagues over last night for dinner who are new grandparents for the first time. They have a 4-month-old grandchild, and they're like figuring out how they're going to be a wall now that there's a grandchild in the mix. So this is parenting is not a sprint; it's a marathon where God continues to teach us. And can we, be grounded in our own identity, belonging, and purpose enough that we can be that wall even when our kids are swimming away.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I personally have, when I think of a wall, I think it's strong and not moving, like stable, and we're regulated, and
Yeah.
we're not all over the place. And then I also think like a wall can be kind of stoic, but we don't want to be stoic. We want to be empathetic.
Mhm.
Um, I tend to be overly empathetic with my
Yeah.
kids,
Yeah.
and they react against that.
Yeah.
They're like, "Mom, you're babying me. Like, I'm fine." So that balance of like empathy, but not too much empathy,
Yeah.
and like being firm. Like that's just a tricky thing for me. And I just brought that up as you're talking about the wall.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, Joyce, if I could just add, I mean, I know your husband, Tim, and I know the kind of partnership that you have. And that's where parenting is not a solo sport. And being an adult mentor, it's not a solo sport. Ideally, we're journeying through life with others. And I was raised by a single mom who had many amazing friends who were there for her and who could help her figure out, like, how do I respond to this? Am I being overly empathetic? Am I not being empathetic enough? And so, just as I mentioned, Brad and I have had countless hallway conversations talking about our own kids, trying to figure it out. Whether it's your spouse, whether it's another relative, whether it's somebody at your church, whether it's a neighbor. Like, I'm so grateful for the adults who know me and know my kids and can give me that perspective and say, yeah, for me, I'm overly helpful with my kids. And so they could say, yeah, Carrie, you're being overly helpful, back off a little bit. And hopefully we have those kind of relationships, regardless of what our family situation is.
Absolutely. I think that is so helpful, just to get other eyes on us, and to know that our kids at one stage, they might have wanted that empathy, but then as they mature, they were at different points, they may not.
Yeah.
So it is a moving target for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, and that's, I mean, to tie both of those scenarios back to purpose, the overly helpfulness and the over empathy. Sometimes, what kids are sort of saying, but behind what they're saying is, I need to figure this out for myself, right?
Yeah.
Like I need to kind of grow in my own agency and decision making. They're not going to articulate it that way. They're going to say back off, or, leave me alone. But that is, really tied to they're actively working out this sense of agency and purpose and their own sense of like, I can do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And
They're
we
pushing off that wall and
unintentionally.
they're trying to swim, and we're like trying to hang on to them.
Yeah, right. Right. Because we know more, we
Yeah.
can be helpful.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
often do know the answer, or we do know what
Yeah.
they need to do next.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
sort of that fine dance of being available and also not being overly helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
A great phrase that, if my kids like counted the number of times that I've asked this of them, they would be alarmed probably, but because I do it all the time. And that is, what's your plan? What's your plan for how you're going to get that school assignment done? Or what's your plan for how you're going to, turn in that application? Or what's your plan for cleaning your room before, XYZ happens? And that what's your plan phrase has been really helpful to communicate to my kids, I believe in them. And I know I want to give you agency to figure this out, but it still gives me a little bit of information about what they're thinking. So that's been another
good.
helpful
I wrote
question.
that one down, Kara, because it's better than like, why haven't you cleaned your room?
When are you going to
do
yes,
that?
exactly.
So I'm gonna say, what's your plan?
What's your plan?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's really good. Well, I'm going to move to another topic, and that's technology and social media. We grew up without that. So I feel like this is a parenting frontier of like, we didn't experience this when we were teenagers.
Yeah.
So now as we're parenting, we're like, what do we do? And the bigger question for me is like, how is this shaping them? How is technology and social media affecting their development, their brains, their faith? So just to throw that question out there, because I know it's one that many of us parents are wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, of course we could spend hours on this. It's big, it's huge when we're talking about how the digital world is shaping young people. And, the reality is we are out of touch as adults. Even those of us who really try hard, we did not grow up in the same world. And that world is moving fast, and it's the only world they've ever known. They're just trying to make their way in it. But it is absolutely shaping how they answer their questions, because it becomes the environment in which they're working these things out. One of the things, I mean, just a few thoughts. One around identity, as we know and have seen, and we actively kind of see this play out. A lot of teenagers, they sort of feel like they have to work on their personal brand. Every moment becomes a broadcast opportunity. And, if you've ever seen a teenager take 300 pictures of themselves and then try to sort out the best two to post, I mean, it's that, like, there's that. And then there's also the sort of becoming internet famous part of it that seems to be something to long for, and, but I think we write all that off. But it is part of the work of identity. It's part of how they're working it out and some of the cues they're getting. And so being there with them to help them navigate, what's real and what's not, and how do you feel about that? How does that make you feel about yourself? Those are important questions for us to ask, but not to just sort of write it off or to shame them. We can't shame them for the only world that they have been given by adults, honestly, right? So there's also, social media can be a real source of belonging, and it can facilitate purpose. There are kids who find connection on social media. So many kids they're connecting most in social spaces with the people they also connect with in real life. So for a majority of teenagers, that's true. That's not true for all. And others, they're finding ways to be activists and to speak out and to, or to organize through social media and to, really work out their purpose in those spaces too. We should say, though, I mean, of course, there's an important caveat here that the research case is building for delaying when we let them into these spaces. More and more, the research is showing that the earlier teenagers are active on these platforms, and preteens, the more social media complicates their search for identity, belonging, and purpose. It gets tied up. They're more at risk for trouble with mental health concerns, with physical health, and all kinds of other things that are just important to the work of adolescence. So, that case is really being built. And I think it's something for us to pay attention to, again, without shaming them, without judging them. Maybe we can, another piece there for kids who are active and we have questions, again, as leaders or as parents, to just ask, how do you feel about your social media use these days? How do you think it impacts your friendships? Do you think it's making your friendships better or worse, or not really having an impact? Even if they don't really want to answer a question like that, it can get them thinking about what is social media doing for them. And it's complicated. I think it's complicated for adults too.
Right. And I feel like my two older ones have phones, and their relationship with social media is different. Their personalities are different. So one who is really seeking belonging has a hard time disengaging from social media because she's looking so hard for belonging.
Yeah.
And the other one asks us, is we have a time limit that we have, like a certain set of amount of time they can be on certain apps. And is saying, can you decrease the amount of time? I don't want to be on it that much. So she's asking for us to decrease her time because she's like, I don't want to be distracted. So it's just kind of all over the map depending on each kid, I feel. But I think what you said, Brad, like they're working out these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose in this, on digital world. And we want to help them do that the best way without exposing them to a lot of the negative things on social media. And that's hard because there's both the positive and the negative. And And, there's going to be both out there. So we have some really great questions from the chat that I want to move to. One is from Jessica, and she asks, this is probably something that a lot of us face too, is like there are teens who are just withdrawn and disengaged, and no matter how much we're trying to like connect with them or prompt them to talk to us, they just don't. So I'm just wondering if you have any pointers for Jess.
Yeah, well, I'd love to take that. My daughter's name is Jessica, so I have a bias there. So it's fun to have a question from Jessica. My favorite way to think about that actually comes. I'll tell you a story of a mom I met some years ago who came up to me after I spoke, and she said, my teenage son, he does not want to talk with me. And I asked him, like, do you want to go out to eat or get some coffee? And he'll say no. Do you want to go shopping? That's a strong no. And she said, I've really struggled with spending time with him or having any conversation with him. But she said, I finally realized that my son is really into movies. And so she said, I don't really like movies, but I've become a student of movies because my son is into movies. And so I know what's releasing soon. I know a lot about directors and actors and genres and all this that I've brushed up on myself because it's important to my son. And she said, the only time my son wants to spend time with me is when I ask him if he wants to go to a movie. And so she said, I try to pick movies that are a little bit deeper. And then this really wise mom, she said, I even buy tickets at a theater that's further away geographically than I need, because she says my best conversations are on the drive home from movies. And so I want that extra 7 minutes because that's when I get to connect with my boy. And so I just really admire this mom because she's not into movies, but because her son is, she's become into movies. And so she can have conversations. I am not a crafty person. I do not like arts and crafts. One of our kids was really into arts and crafts. And so there was a season where I sucked it up and went to arts and craft stores and, we did stuff together. Luckily, that child is no longer so into arts and crafts. But nonetheless, like I had to lean into what was important to that child. So I just think that example from that mom is so powerful. Like, what is your kid into? Is it the Marvel universe? Is it, what is it on social media? And how can you study up on that so that you can have better conversations? Is it video gaming? There's a lot of parents who would, rather vacuum than play video games, but because their kids are into video games, they've said, you know what, I'm going to learn. And then I'm going to let my teenager teach me, which puts the teenager in kind of an authoritative position, which is a good thing for the family dynamic. So whatever it is, whether it's arts and crafts, video games, movies, how can we lean into what's important for our young person?
That's so good. My husband was just telling me yesterday, why don't you play Roblox with Hannah, because that's what she loves.
Yeah.
And, I have no desire, but I think the fact that I heard that from him yesterday and this from you, Kara, I'm like, okay, maybe we need to be doing
Roblox, here you come, Joyce.
Yes.
Yeah, even the power of showing interest, of even just, I remember one dad saying it was like a breakthrough moment when he asked his teenage son, can I just watch you play this game? Like, can you just show me and explain it to me so that I understand? Because I know you're really into it. And his son, he was so surprised. His son said, of course. And he was shocked because he'd been getting the wall, like the
bad wall.
Yeah, but it opened up something. And I think, for that dad, it was shifting from, he had been dismissive and kind of judgmental about that gaming was so much of an interest. And when he shifted to be curious and to let his son be the expert and be interesting, that shifted something.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really good. Here's another question from the chat. How do you navigate the complexities of identity in a shifting culture around gender, LGBTQ LGBTQ identity, race, and other, topics that we may actually not feel super equipped to talk about ourselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and of course, very common these days. There's all sorts of new questions, even about identity, that our young people are navigating and wrestling with themselves. So, Joyce, I like how you frame that question. That maybe we're not confident ourselves, that we don't feel like we know enough. Well, that's a great first step. Then, how can you get a little bit more informed on what your young person is thinking about? And so, is there another parent you can talk to who knows something? Is there a book you can read? Is there a pastor or a teacher or a counselor you can talk to? So you enter the conversation feeling a little bit more equipped, or actually a lot more equipped, to have the conversation. So I would say, yes, get informed. Joyce, you used a powerful term some minutes ago when you said, like, we have to regulate ourselves. And so just as you kind of get your brain full of information, get your heart in a place where you won't overreact, but you can be that safe, unconditional, loving wall. And then, I would just say, it's a pretty common scenario, and this is true in my family, where our kids are a little bit more progressive on various cultural issues than we are as parents. And my best conversations with my own kids about that tends to be where I really listen. I listen. And once I share my perspective, once I share my perspective, if I ask my kid first, like, well, what do you disagree with in what I've just said? And I invite them to first honestly critique what I've just shared. Then, and they often have critiques or things they disagree with. But then when I follow that up with the other side of the coin, what might be true or what might you agree with in what I shared, the fact that they've had a chance to, talk about what they disagree with first, it makes them so much more open to say, yeah, but you might be right about this, or I should probably think a little bit more about that. Or so I would say, study, get your heart in a good place, and then think about the conversation that you want to have. Listen, and then invite your kid to, first critique you and then agree with you. And then I think the last thing I would add is maybe there's another adult who should be part of that conversation too. So, is there a small group leader? Is there a pastor? Is there someone that they really trust and respect, who can also help in that conversation and help the conversation be safer and probably more fruitful for everybody involved? So, Brad, do you have anything else to add to that? Because I think that's a real question for a lot of families and a lot of adults.
Yeah, you hit a lot of really great stuff there. A couple other things that come to mind.
Yeah.
And it's they feel when our anxiety is high. And so really, really trying to be non-anxious in those conversations is just so important. And just for us to always keep in mind, the relationship is more important than anything else here.
That's good.
And so, like, my kids' views on something, or my kids' perspective, my kids' identities, or, their activism or their politics, like whatever it is that might make us a little bit uncomfortable, or we don't understand, or whatever it is, none of that is as important as our relationship. And so whatever we can do to preserve the relationship and keep it open. And, to Kara's point, it doesn't mean you can't ever express how you see things, but the relationship is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And
That's good.
One of the questions, or actually it's a pair of questions that we have found so helpful and I've used repeatedly, are this: to say to a young person, especially as they're coming to own their faith or maybe think differently about faith and life than you are or you have, is to ask them this: what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? And what do you no longer believe that you think I do believe? So what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? What do you no longer believe that you think I do believe? And I mean, that's just such a great question to ask a young person you're close to at any time, or a great pair of questions, because I love that it communicates that faith is something that continues to grow and mature. And I mean, hopefully all of our faith is growing. And so that means we might see things a little bit differently. And it also makes things discussable. When they are changing their views, I'd so much rather have that out in the open than something they feel like they can't talk about with me. So
That's such an inviting pair of questions. And it's
Yeah.
just, it's about inviting dialogue rather than kind of trying to change their viewpoint. But in the process of dialogue, it just, it makes them feel safe with us, you know, and it keeps that relationship going. Such good tips. I have a couple questions in the chat about church. And so our churches, as you mentioned, Kara, earlier, like people in this generation are less religious and may not be attending church as much. And we might feel nostalgic for a time when our churches were full of youth, and it may not be that case in everybody's church these days. Then how can we make our churches more welcoming to teens? And then another question I feel like for me is like, how do we meet our teens where they're at if they're not in the pews on Sundays? It doesn't mean that we can't be engaging them outside of the walls of the church, but in church-like ways, I guess. So.
Yeah. Okay. I have a quick story there. So some of our previous research for a project called Growing Young was all about churches that are doing well engaging young people, teenagers and young adults. And one of the factors that really bubbled to the top in those churches out of our research was what we called warmth. And warmth is when young people describe their church as like family. Like family. These people are like my family. And they talk about, you know, just this sense of being seen and heard and welcomed. And that warmth factor was so connected to how much a young person felt like they were a part of their church, and honestly, that they wanted to be there. And I'll tell a quick story too from my own church. You know, one way we can get there is just by asking young people about their own experience of church. And some leaders in our church asked a group of teenagers, you know, when do you feel most connected with our church? What do you appreciate? What do you wish was different? And just listen to that. One of the things that emerged out of that is that our teenagers said, you know what? We really love it when people in the church come to our stuff, when they come to our games, when they come to our performances, you know, the things that we're doing outside of church, to your point. And so we just started trying to get better at saying, you know, hey, you know, Joel, my son, has a musical this Friday, you know, this weekend, and here's where you can get tickets. And we actually say that on Sunday morning. And then people show up. I went to, so Joel is my son, and a bunch of people from church, you know, came to his musical last weekend. It was so meaningful to him. I went to a soccer game a couple of weeks ago for another 16-year-old at our church. And, you know, I show up at her soccer game. Now I'm on the pastoral team and I'm friends with her parents. I have a lot of reasons to be there. There was an 80-year-old who was there from our church, and he came because, you know, on Sunday morning we said, you know, Haven has a soccer game, and he came to cheer her on. And that's so meaningful, right? And it's a small thing. It's a small thing, but just really showing up where they are. And the step before that of asking them, you know, when do you feel connected to our church? So that's just a quick example that came to mind.
Yeah, I love that. Kara, did you have something you want to add?
Well, Brad, there's so many good principles in what you just shared, because yes, it is about listening to young people and what they want. And then it's about being a church, which, by the way, church is not a building. Church is a group of people. And it's being a church that doesn't expect young people to always come to us. But in the examples you just gave, it's the body of Christ going to where young people are. So a lot of churches these days are seeing that there's fewer teenagers around, families haven't returned from the pandemic, et cetera. And this is the chance for us to say, you don't have to walk into our doors. We're going to go build a relationship with you where you're at. And, I was a youth group kid in the 80s, and then I was a youth pastor in the 90s. And part of me wishes that we had youth group faith in the 80s again, or, faith like youth group in the 80s. But we don't. It's 2025, and churches are different. Young people are different. Culture's different. And so how do we go into the world? And this is where identity, belonging, and purpose are such a helpful paradigm, because, anytime we're talking to a young person, if we can ask ourselves, what are they seeking? Are they seeking identity? Are they seeking belonging? Are they seeking purpose? And how do I best enter into that? How do I have a conversation about that? I'll probably never use the words identity, belonging, and purpose, but having that in my mind, especially with my own kids, like when any of my kids are doing something that just feels a little off, a little bit not like them, if I take a step back and say, okay, what's going on here? What are they seeking? Are they trying to find their identity? Are they trying to find a sense of belonging? Are they trying to find a sense of purpose? Then all of a sudden it's like the penny drops and I come to understand it. And so, I would say when you're showing up at a soccer game or you're showing up at a musical, you're supporting that kid's sense of identity, belonging, and purpose. And so that's a great example, Brad. Thanks for sharing that.
That's so good. I feel like with just the loss of community sometimes that we used to have in the church, what you said, what both of you shared, it's like fostering that community and those ties where the kids are at, whether that's like they're supporting their shows, if they're on stage performing, or going to the soccer field where they're
or
at,
doing Roblox. I mean, it might be
doing
Roblox.
Oh, I know. All of those things where we get to know the other parents that are there too. And we're just strengthening community where they don't feel alone out there. Where I feel like that village that they have, so that they're not, as struggling as much with mental health and anxiety, like we're showing up in their spaces. It's not going to solve everything, but I feel like the conversations that we want to have with our kids, we're just creating more opportunities for that. This has been so helpful, Kara and Brad. I want to thank you so much for sharing so much of your research and just your life experience parenting with us. And for those of you watching, I want to encourage you guys to get a subscription to Seminary Now. You can learn more at seminarynow.com. And of course, here is their course called Connecting with Teenagers. And for those of you who participated today, you can get Brad and Kara's course as a standalone. If you're not sure about getting the whole subscription yet, we're offering you a 25% off discount today and tomorrow only. Just use the code TEENS25 at checkout. And we'd like to invite you for our next webinar on April 10th with Dr. Beth Felker Jones, as she is a professor of theology at Northern Seminary and an instructor for the upcoming Seminary Now 4-credit Christian theology course. Her webinar is on the Trinity, your most pressing questions answered. So we'd love for you to come and join us then. And thank you all for being with us today. And I pray that this conversation has helped you better understand how to engage with the teenagers you care about in your life. Thanks, and have a great day.